So you want to know more about the academic article that helped transform the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and their racial policy. I've done previous videos in which I focus on the end of the Latter-day Saint Church's racial restriction in 1978. And I want to say from the outset that the primary driver was the church's concern of becoming an international church, and particularly their growth in places like Brazil, where the mixed racial ancestry made their one-drop rule of racial restriction impossible. But another key factor that played a key role in the end of the racial restriction was the academic scholarship, which helped overturn traditional understandings of where the Latter-day Saint racial restriction came from. And one article did more work in that vein than nearly any other. So as part of my Friday series of videos of So You Want to Know More About X, in which I peel back the curtain and talk about the work behind academic scholarship, today I want to talk about the story of Lester Bush's classic article, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine and Historical Overview, that was published in 1973 by Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, one of the most consequential articles in Mormon history. Let's dig in. But first, we need to talk about the context. Now, remember, the Latter-day Saint tradition had an entrenched racial restriction that had been in place for the entirety of the 20th century up until that point. That made it so men who had African ancestry could not be ordained to the priesthood, and both men and women with African ancestry, just one African ancestor, was enough to bar them from temple rituals, the core of the Latter-day Saint tradition. I don't want to regurgitate that entire history here. You can go watch my previous videos. I'd had a whole series on the origins and development and evolution and the eventual end of that restriction. But what's key here is that going into the 1970s, there were several key ideological stances, backgrounds, justifications that were often offered for that racial restriction. Most notoriously, that it was believed to have originated with Joseph Smith, the idea that Joseph Smith had instituted that racial restriction, and that it was therefore a doctrine based in revelatory truth, which made it difficult to overturn. Even someone like David O. McKay, who was the LDS president in the 1950s and 1960s, tried to curtail and limit the scope of the restriction, but in the end he decided he couldn't due to its historic and revelatory origins, at least as he understood them. Now, the racial restriction came under direct threat during the 1960s and 1970s due to the rise of the civil rights movement, when many people in America, including Latter-day Saints, started questioning these traditional racist practices, this anti-Black racist theology and policies that many institutions, including the LDS Church, took for granted. And among those Latter-day Saints who were bothered by the racial restriction was Lester Bush, who, as a student at the University of Virginia, who would eventually become a doctor, became interested in the topic due to all the media coverage surrounding George Romney's 1968 presidential run, where a lot of the national focus was on, well, can we elect a president who comes from a religious tradition that practices racial segregation? Now, Romney's campaign fizzled before he got to the general stage in 1968, but that national attention did not go away. And according to Lester Bush, the topic of Mormonism's racial past became an obsession, something that he wanted to dig into more than other scholars, frankly, had done up until that point. By the way, if you enjoy this type of scholarship and appreciate nerding out over historical topics and connecting their relevance to the present, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Every Monday, I do deep dives on a particular historical topic. Wednesday, I connect historical past to the present reality and show why it's relevant. And then on Fridays, I peel back the curtain and talk about the background of historical scholarship, either talking about secondary literature or dissecting primary sources so that you too can better understand how we get our historical knowledge. And if you want to give back, I encourage you to consider becoming a member of this channel as a way to make sure that we can continue doing this work. Anyways, let's get back to the topic at hand. Once Lester Bush graduated, he became a doctor for the Navy, a very busy job, especially during the Vietnam War. That's going to take him overseas. But his obsession with dissecting Mormonism's racial past did not go away. If anything, it escalated, and he continued researching as much as he could, at first relying on public documents, but then doing some personal research of his own at the archival collections of Utah at the University of Utah, Utah State University, and Brigham Young University, finding collections of church authorities that had donated their sources there, something that's going to be important later on in this video. He even met with Joseph Fielding Smith, who was a church historian at the time, about to become the church president, but did not have any luck, so he did not get access to the LDS Church's archives. That opening did not come until a bit later. Now, he would compile all the sources he could find related to Mormonism's racial restriction, and then place them in chronological order. A process that I strongly recommend if you are interested in doing historical research. I do that with every one of my books. I get all the sources that I've researched, and then I put them in a chronological order to see what pops out. And what popped out to Lester Bush when he placed all these primary sources in order was that the racial restriction did not begin with Joseph Smith. That was his big takeaway, and that challenged the traditional narrative that the Latter-day Saint Church and even many scholars had accepted at that point. It was a revolutionary argument that would soon have broad repercussions. Now, Bush was not the only person researching the topic at the time. There were several others, and among them was a Princeton student by the name of Stephen Taggart, who wrote his senior thesis on the very topic, and he titled it Social Stress and the Emergence of Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, a paper that won an award from Dialogue. But unlike Lester Bush, Stephen Taggart, he revised the Mormon historical understanding, but he saw the origins as earlier than Bush. He thought that the racial restriction was implemented by Joseph Smith, but in response to the Missouri crisis, that after the Mormons were kicked out of Missouri, in part due to the enslavers in the Missouri not liking the Yankees and seeing them as too racially universalistic, that the Mormons responded trying to find cultural assimilation and adopting the racial restriction. And that was a novel argument. It said, even though it placed the racial restriction with Joseph Smith, it said that it was in response to external social pressures and it was not there at the origins. That's why the article was so novel, and it won an award from Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, one of the premier cultural repositories for Mormon scholarship and culture then and even now. And then when Taggart had an untimely death, his family, instead of publishing the article with Dialogue, which was expected with the award, they published it as a standalone book. And that book gained national attention. Even the New York Times published a story saying that, look, the origins of Mormonism's racial restriction, that thing that the nation became so fascinated with during George Romney's run, that had human origins, not divine origins. Now, lots of scholars were willing to accept this new theory, but not Lester Bush. Lester Bush, now overseas working as a medic for the Navy, read it and was unconvinced with the argument. So he wrote a long review for Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, that was then published, in which he says that I don't agree with this theory that it originated with Joseph Smith. I thought it was later. And so he decided, after publishing that article, he sent off the final proofs of his book review right before he was sent to the U.S. Embassy in Cyprus. And then he decided he was going to continue studying until he could tell the entire story and correct the narrative. A couple years later, while based at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, Vietnam, what a place to live in the early 1970s, he heard bombshells all around him. He would eventually become part of that evacuation, but he also served in the LDS branch presidency while serving there. But while he was there, his documentary chronology of the racial origins of the racial restriction now totaled over 1,000 documents and over 400 single-spaced pages of transcript. He would take that document, this chronology, and share it with several others, including church leaders in the region, where it eventually came in the hands of Boyd K. Packer, who was just called as an apostle in the Quorum of the 12. He previously worked in the church education system, which is why he was known by a lot of scholars and people in the church. And Boyd K. Packer took an interest in this project, and they frequently corresponded and spoke. Boyd K. Packer obviously was not too thrilled with several of the things that Bush came up with. Eventually, Bush wrote a long narrative article that would supplement his chronology and that he wanted to be published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, and he submitted it in 1973. When he told that to Boyd K. Packer, Packer was upset. He told Bush, please hold off on publishing it, especially in Dialogue, until the Quorum of the 12 Apostles can read and discuss your article and decide what to do. In this long phone call between Lester Bush in Vietnam and Boyd K. Packer in Salt Lake City, Bush got the distinct impression that Packer was trying to make it clear that you should pull your article, but he didn't want to come out and specifically say you should pull your article because he knew that those would have consequences beyond just the article itself. Now, eventually, Bush was part of a medical evac that took someone to the United States, which allowed him to visit Utah in the summer of 1973, shortly after he submitted the article. While he was in Salt Lake City, he went and visited with Leonard Arrington, the church historian, got access to some documents, told his whole story, which is how we get some of the details from Leonard Arrington's diary from 1973. And he also met in person with Boyd K. Packer, who urged that it was unfortunate that Bush decided to publish in Dialogue, a journal that church leaders already saw as alternate voices that can't be trusted. And he made it clear that the brethren would really, really like it if he didn't go forward with publication. But Bush was undaunted. He decided that this article was important enough to go forward, even though he knew it might come with some serious consequences within the church, including from leaders disappointed with his decision to move forward with the article itself. Now, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, was at that point edited by Robert Rees, an LDS academic who was affiliated with UCLA. And he was feeling the pressure. He knew the significance of this article, and he wanted several people to respond to it, even people who disagreed with it. So he arranged a roundtable of scholars who were going to respond to the article in print to show a diversity of opinions. The journal was titled Dialogue, after all. But now that the church knew that the article was coming out, because Boyd K. Packer had a copy of it, they did all they could to try to stop it. They made several of the roundtable participants pull out, including Truman Madsen, who is a BYU scholar and an apologist, and he told the editor that that the article is now a tar baby and I don't want to get stuck. A very unfortunate analogy to use in this circumstances for obvious reasons. The University of Utah history professor James Clayton was supposed to participate in the roundtable. He had to pull out because his bishop was told that you will be disciplined if you participate in this roundtable, so he pulled out as well. The only LDS scholar who agreed to continue going forward with the roundtable was Hugh Nibley, the classicist and Mormon apologist who had some very interesting, let's call it, takes on the topic. And he was like, I still want my voice heard. And so his article went forward. On the eve of the article's publication, a BYU administrator called the Dialogue editor Robert Rees and urged him not to publish it, saying it would be the Rubicon, crossing the Rubicon, the march toward war for Dialogue. Dialogue would no longer be trusted, especially because much of the article was based on research that Lester Bush had done in the BYU special collections, research into sources that LDS authorities did not know was available at BYU. So BYU had a self-interest in this, knowing that they would get in trouble because their own primary sources held in their library was now being used at this article that was going to be denounced by church leaders. But Dialogue decided to still move forward. The article, titled Mormonism's Negro Doctrine and Historical Overview by Lester Bush, appeared in a 1973 issue of Dialogue. It was 58 pages long. It contained 219 footnotes, detailed, exhaustive, definitive in showing that the racial restriction did not begin with Joseph Smith. There was so much interest in the article that Dialogue actually printed a standalone pamphlet of the article separate from the issue because so many people wanted to purchase a copy. And it made ripples throughout the Latter-day Saint community. There's a story of someone walking into the Apostle Bruce R. McConkie's office right while he was slamming it on the desk saying, crap. And yet there were other LDS authorities who recognized its potential. One general authority, Marion D. Hanks, would later say that discussions surrounding the article fomented the pot. And the Spencer W. Kimball family say that in Spencer W. Kimball's personal records is a deeply annotated copy of Lester Bush's article. And Spencer W. Kimball, the prophet who would go on to end the racial restriction, was therefore informed of this historical argument, showing that this was a historical policy, not a revelatory doctrine from Joseph Smith. Now, Lester Bush was eventually called in by his ecclesiastical authorities to discuss it, but thankfully, no action was taken. Now, I want to emphasize again, the most important issue in the LDS Church overturning its racial restriction was the growth of the church abroad, and especially the growth of the church in Brazil, where they had just announced they were going to build a temple, but the racial makeup of Brazil made it impossible to maintain their one-drop rule on the racial restriction. But scholarship, especially Lester Bush's article, enabled that transformation, because once they knew that the racial restriction was a policy that was brought about after Joseph Smith, and therefore not attached to the sacred original prophet, and based in cultural concerns rather than revealed doctrine, that made the policy more easy, or made it easier to rescind it. And that's why this Lester Bush article was so crucial. It was also crucial in the development of Mormon studies as an academic field, showing scholars that you can buck these traditional orthodox narratives and provide revisionist accounts that have real consequences and influence. Later historians have since fleshed out the story even more, showing that the development and the implementation of that racial restriction was much more inchoate, it was much more haphazard, and it came much later than even Lester Bush thought, the topic that I've discussed in other videos. Now, one of the reasons we have so much information on this fascinating story and the background of this article is that Lester Bush and those involved have participated in several retrospectives talking about its origins. Let me highlight a few, the links to which should be found in the description of this video. First, I strongly recommend the original article, Lester Bush's Mormonism's Negro Doctrine and Historical Overview, for the 1973 volume of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. It's just a classic in Mormon scholarly literature. I also recommend his retrospective from 25 years later, Writing Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, Context and Reflections, that was published in Journal of Mormon History in 1998. And then at the 45-year mark, Lester Bush, this would be his last retrospective before his unfortunate death a few years ago, he wrote a retrospective titled Looking Back, Looking Forward, considering the impact 45 years later. And then you can get a diversity of voices reflecting on the impact of the article in a 50th anniversary roundtable published in Dialogue just a few years ago. All these articles, again, should be linked in the description so you can read them yourself. This is a fascinating story. It shows the power of history and its impact on community, something that I think should give an example of why scholarship, especially revisionist and dissenting scholarship, is still important. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If so, please hit the like button and share it with others. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. And if you want to give back, we would appreciate it if you become a member of the channel, which enables us to continue producing this content. History has never been more relevant than it is now, which is why it's important to look back at these giants like Lester Bush, who had provided an example of using history as a moral and community reckoning.